Welcome to a journey through one of the most transformative periods in American history. The Vietnam War wasn't just America's longest war at the time, it was a conflict that fundamentally changed how we think about military intervention, media coverage, and the relationship between government and citizens. For those of you too young to remember, imagine a war that played out on your television screen every night. A war where the average age of American soldiers was just 19. A war that divided families, sparked protests on college campuses, and left scars that America is still healing today. This wasn't like World War II, where the enemy and objectives were clear. Vietnam was different. It was a war fought in dense jungles against an enemy who knew every inch of the terrain. It was a war where technology met guerrilla tactics, where the most powerful military in the world struggled against an opponent who refused to fight on conventional terms. Today, we're going to explore four critical aspects of this conflict. The revolutionary use of helicopters that changed warfare forever. The terrifying world of tunnel rats who fought in darkness beneath the jungle. The Tet Offensive that shattered American confidence, and the chaotic fall of Saigon that marked one of the most dramatic conclusions to any American war. The revolution in mobility. When American military planners looked at Vietnam's geography, they faced a nightmare: dense jungle, few roads, mountainous terrain, and an enemy who could disappear into the landscape. Traditional ground movements would be slow, predictable, and vulnerable to ambush. The solution? Take to the skies. The helicopter wasn't new to warfare. It had been used in Korea for medical evacuation. But Vietnam transformed it from a supporting player into the star of the show. The iconic UH-1 Iroquois, better known as the Huey, became the symbol of American presence in Vietnam. That distinctive whop-whop-whop sound became the soundtrack of the war. Air Cavalry, a new kind of soldier. The 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, pioneered a completely new concept: air cavalry. Imagine being able to insert hundreds of soldiers anywhere within minutes, bypassing all traditional obstacles. No more slow columns vulnerable to ambush. Now, American forces could strike quickly, reinforce positions under attack, and evacuate wounded soldiers before they bled out. The typical combat assault was an orchestration of controlled chaos. Hueys would come in low and fast, often in formations called flights. Door gunners would spray suppressive fire as the choppers flared for landing. Soldiers would leap out into elephant grass taller than a man, sometimes directly into enemy fire. The helicopters would lift off immediately. Staying on the ground too long meant becoming a target. The human element. Let's talk about the pilots for a moment. These were often young men in their early 20s, flying missions that required split-second decisions. They'd thread through mountains in heavy fog, land in hot landing zones under fire, and pull off rescues that seemed impossible. The life expectancy of a helicopter pilot in heavy combat could be measured in weeks. And the door gunners, teenagers manning M60 machine guns with nothing but open air and thin metal between them and enemy fire. They'd lean out into the wind, searching for muzzle flashes in the jungle below, covering their comrades as they jumped from the chopper. Medical evacuation, the golden hour. Here's a statistic that tells you everything about the helicopter's impact. In World War II, if you were seriously wounded, you had about a 30% chance of dying from your wounds. In Vietnam, that dropped to less than 20%. The reason? Dust-off helicopters, medical evacuation choppers that could get wounded soldiers from the battlefield to a field hospital in minutes. There was an unwritten rule that dust-off pilots followed. They came for you no matter what. Hot landing zone, They came. Bad weather? They came. Night operation? They came. These unarmed or lightly armed helicopters would descend into hell itself to pull out wounded Americans. The limitations, but helicopters weren't invincible. The Huey was essentially a flying gas tank wrapped in thin aluminum. A few well-placed shots could bring one down, and the Viet Cong learned to set up ambushes specifically targeting helicopters. They'd wait until choppers were committed to landing, then open up with everything they had. The jungle canopy created its own problems. Landing zones had to be carved out of the jungle, often under fire. Helicopters stirred up massive amounts of dust and debris on landing, creating brownouts where pilots flew blind for critical seconds. The legacy. The helicopter doctrine developed in Vietnam became fundamental to modern warfare. The air assault concept proved that speed and mobility could overcome numerical disadvantages. Every modern military helicopter, from the Apache to the Black Hawk, traces its tactical employment back to lessons learned in Vietnam. But there's a deeper lesson here too. The helicopter gave American commanders unprecedented flexibility, but it also created a temptation to use firepower and mobility as a substitute for strategy. American forces could go anywhere, strike anywhere, but without a clear political objective, all that mobility couldn't win the war. The Underground War. While helicopters ruled the skies, an entirely different war was being fought beneath the ground. The Cu Chi tunnels and similar systems represented one of the most ingenious defensive networks in military history. Imagine an underground city stretching for 150 miles, complete with hospitals, sleeping quarters, kitchens, and weapons factories, all hidden beneath the Vietnamese countryside. These weren't simple foxholes. The Vietnamese had been digging these tunnels for decades, first to fight the French, then expanded to fight the Americans. Multiple levels, trapdoors hidden under leaves and brush, false tunnels designed to trap intruders, and the whole system narrow enough that the typically smaller Vietnamese fighters could navigate, but larger American soldiers would struggle. The volunteers enter the tunnel rats. These were the soldiers who volunteered, and it had to be volunteers to go into these tunnels and fight the enemy on their own ground. Think about what that means. You're crawling into pitch darkness, into a space so tight you can't turn around. The air is thick and stifling. You're armed with only a pistol and a flashlight because anything larger won't fit. And somewhere in that darkness, an enemy fighter might be waiting around the next turn. Who volunteers for this? Smaller soldiers had an advantage. The tunnels averaged about 2.5 feet square, sometimes smaller. Claustrophobia was disqualifying. You needed steady nerves and a particular kind of courage that doesn't get talked about enough. The descent picture this. Your unit has found a tunnel entrance. Maybe it was spotted during a sweep. Maybe someone literally fell through a hidden trapdoor. Protocol says, clear it. That means someone has to go down there. You check your gear. Pistol, usually a .45 caliber M1911, because if you need it, you'll need it up close. Flashlight, but using it makes you a target. Knife, maybe a gas mask. Some tunnel rats carried a rope tied around their ankle so buddies could pull them out if something went wrong. You lower yourself into the entrance. It's like descending into another world. The temperature drops. The smell hits you. Earth, decay, bat guano, cordite from recent firefights, sometimes worse. Your eyes adjust slowly to the darkness. The walls press in on all sides. You move forward, inches at a time, listening for any sound, watching for tripwires, checking for booby traps. The dangers. And there were so many ways to die down there. Booby traps were everywhere. Punji stakes, grenades rigged to wires, even snakes placed deliberately by the Viet Cong. The tunnels would sometimes have sharp turns, with small chambers, where an enemy fighter could wait, armed and ready. Then there were the environmental dangers, cave-ins, bad air. Some sections would flood during monsoon season. Bats carried diseases. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine being trapped underground in total darkness, knowing the earth could collapse on you at any moment. Cat and mouse. Sometimes tunnel rats would encounter enemy soldiers. These firefights were unlike anything else in warfare. Total darkness, deafening noise in confined space, both sides knowing there was no room to maneuver. It was brutal, primal combat. Other times, it was like deadly hide-and-seek. The Vietnamese would hide in specially constructed chambers, waiting for the American to pass before emerging. Or they'd retreat deeper, leading the tunnel rat further in. Sometimes they'd seal off sections, trapping the invader. Intelligence gathering. But tunnel rats weren't just fighters. They were intelligence gatherers, finding documents, mapping tunnel systems, discovering cache sites, understanding enemy capabilities. The information they brought back was invaluable. American forces learned about enemy supply networks, hospital locations, command centers, all from what tunnel rats discovered underground. The tools of the trade. Over time, tunnel rats developed specialized equipment. Tunnel smoke grenades to force out defenders. Mine detectors small enough for tunnel work. Communication wire to stay in contact with the surface. Some units even trained dogs specifically for tunnel work, though this had limited success. Engineers developed tunnel denial techniques, explosives designed to collapse tunnel sections, chemical agents to make tunnels uninhabitable. But the Vietnamese were always one step ahead, building ventilation systems, reinforcing key sections, creating alternative routes. The psychological weight. Let's talk about what this did to these men. Every tunnel rat has stories of close calls, of moments when they should have died, but didn't. The psychological screening for these volunteers was intense, but even the toughest minds struggled with the constant stress. Many tunnel rats developed a sixth sense about danger. They'd describe feelings of dread before encountering booby traps, or knowing somehow that an enemy was waiting around the next turn. Whether this was heightened awareness or something else, it kept them alive. The legacy. The tunnel rats never numbered more than a few hundred, but their contribution was outsized. They cleared thousands of enemy positions, discovered massive weapons caches, and provided crucial intelligence. But perhaps more importantly, they represented something uniquely American: the willingness of volunteers to do an impossible job because someone had to do it. Today, the Q Chi tunnels are a tourist attraction. They've been widened for Western tourists, but sections remain as they were: narrow, dark, claustrophobic. And when you visit, guides will tell you stories of the American soldiers who had the courage to enter those tunnels and fight in the dark. The setup. By late 1967, the American public was being told the war was going well. General William Westmoreland had recently declared that the end begins to come into view. The official narrative was clear: we were winning. The enemy was weakening. It was just a matter of time. Military and political leaders pointed to body counts, territory controlled, successful operations. President Johnson's administration needed good news. Domestic opposition to the war was growing, and 1968 was an election year. The message from Saigon and Washington was consistent. Progress, albeit slow, was being made. Vietnamese families were preparing for Tet, the Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnamese culture. Traditionally, there was an informal ceasefire during Tet. Families would reunite, celebrate, honor ancestors. Both sides had observed this custom in previous years. There was no reason to think 1968 would be different. The storm breaks January 30th, 1968, 2:45 a.m. The unofficial ceasefire is shattered as 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters launch coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. This wasn't guerrilla warfare. This was a conventional offensive on a massive scale. In Saigon, the capital supposedly secure behind layers of defense, sappers blasted through the wall of the U.S. Embassy compound. For 6 hours, American military police and Marine guards fought off attackers inside the embassy grounds. Television cameras captured it all. The symbol of American presence in Vietnam under assault. In Hueys, Vietnam's ancient imperial capital, 10,000 North Vietnamese troops seized the city. What followed was 26 days of brutal urban combat. American and South Vietnamese forces fought room by room, building by building, to retake the city. It was some of the most intense fighting of the entire war. The media war. Here's where the story gets complicated. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for North Vietnam. Of the 80,000 attackers, more than half became casualties. They failed to hold any major city. The general uprising they expected from the South Vietnamese population never materialized. The Viet Cong infrastructure was decimated. They never fully recovered their strength. But wars aren't just won on battlefields. They're won in the court of public opinion. And in that arena, Tet was a devastating blow to American credibility. Americans watching television saw their embassy under attack. They saw Marines fighting street by street in Hueys. They saw the famous photo of a South Vietnamese general executing a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street. Most famously, they heard Walter Cronkite, America's most trusted newsman, conclude after visiting Vietnam that the war was unwinnable. The gap between what Americans had been told and what they were seeing was impossible to ignore. If we were winning, why was the enemy capable of launching such a massive offensive? If the South Vietnamese army was strong, why did it require massive American intervention to repel the attacks? If the end was in sight, why did it look like the war was escalating? The battle for Hueys. Let's focus on Hueys for a moment, because it encapsulates everything about Tet. The city had cultural and historical significance. It was the former imperial capital. Taking it was both a military and symbolic objective for North Vietnam. When the city fell on January 31st, it shocked everyone. This wasn't supposed to be possible. American and South Vietnamese forces immediately began planning a counterattack, but they faced enormous challenges. The city was dense urban terrain, narrow streets, thick-walled buildings, limited fields of fire. The North Vietnamese had dug in, fortified positions, and were prepared to fight for every inch. Marines were trained for amphibious assaults and jungle warfare, not urban combat. They had to relearn everything. Small unit tactics in cities are different. You're fighting three-dimensionally, with threats from above and below. The Marines took horrific casualties in those first days. Air support and artillery were complicated by the presence of civilians and the city's historical importance. You couldn't just level the place, so it became an infantryman's fight. Grenades, rifles, sometimes hand-to-hand combat, building by building, block by block. And throughout it all, television cameras were there. Americans saw their sons and brothers fighting in ways that looked nothing like the war they'd been told about. This wasn't search and destroy missions in the jungle. This was the Battle of Stalingrad in miniature. The political earthquake back in the United States. Tet's impact rippled through everything. President Johnson's approval rating plummeted. Anti-war protests intensified. On March 31st, just 2 months after Tet began, Johnson announced he wouldn't seek re-election. Think about that. A sitting president, driven from office in part by a military offensive that we technically won. The military establishment was shaken too. General Westmoreland's request for 206,000 additional troops was leaked to the press. Americans asked a reasonable question. If we're winning, why do we need more troops? The credibility gap became a chasm. What actually happened? Military historians will tell you Tet was a tactical victory for the United States and South Vietnam. The enemy offensive was repulsed. Communist forces suffered devastating casualties. The Viet Cong, as an effective fighting force, was essentially destroyed. North Vietnamese regulars would do most of the fighting from that point forward. But strategic victories aren't just about battlefield outcomes. North Vietnam achieved something more important. They shattered American confidence. They proved the war wasn't nearly over. They demonstrated that no city, no base, no installation was truly secure. And they did it all on camera, for the American public to witness. The lesson? The Tet Offensive taught a lesson that military planners are still grappling with. In modern warfare, perception matters as much as reality. You can win every battle and still lose the war if you lose public support. The North Vietnamese understood this. They were willing to accept horrific casualties to achieve a psychological victory. For Americans, Tet marked the moment when optimistic assessments from military and political leaders lost credibility. It was the point where many Americans concluded that the war might not be winnable, or if it was winnable, the cost would be too high. That shift in public opinion ultimately determined the war's outcome more than any battle. The long retreat. The end didn't come suddenly. It was more like a slow-motion collapse, a gathering inevitability that everyone could see, but few wanted to acknowledge. After the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, American combat troops withdrew. We left behind advisors, massive military aid, and a South Vietnamese army that was well-equipped but facing a determined enemy. For 2 years, South Vietnam held. Then, in early 1975, North Vietnam launched what they thought would be a limited offensive in the Central Highlands. The South Vietnamese response shocked everyone. Instead of fighting, units began to retreat. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a collapse. The dominoes fall province by province, city by city. South Vietnam disintegrated. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Officers fled with their families. Rumors spread faster than facts, creating panic. The South Vietnamese military, despite having more troops and better equipment than the North, simply came apart. Da Nang, Vietnam's second-largest city, fell in chaos. Soldiers fought civilians for spots on evacuation ships. Aircraft took off overloaded with desperate refugees clinging to landing gear. Ships departed with people swimming after them. It was a preview of what would come in Saigon. By mid-April, North Vietnamese forces had surrounded Saigon. American officials still publicly expressed confidence in South Vietnam's ability to hold. Privately, they were planning the largest helicopter evacuation in history. The final days. In Saigon, American officials faced an impossible situation. About 6,000 Americans remained in the city, along with tens of thousands of Vietnamese who had worked with the U.S. and faced certain retaliation if captured. The airport was under rocket attack. The only way out was by helicopter. The evacuation plan, Operation Frequent Wind, called for using the U.S. Embassy and designated buildings around the city as pickup zones. Helicopters would shuttle people to aircraft carriers offshore. It was meant to be orderly. It wasn't. Vietnamese who had been promised evacuation showed up at pickup points with their families only to find chaos. American officials, overwhelmed, made agonizing decisions about who could board helicopters and who couldn't. Some of these Vietnamese had worked for years as translators, intelligence sources, administrative staff. They were marked for death by the communists, and everyone knew it. April 29th, 1975. The final day began with rocket attacks on Tan Son Nhut Air Base, killing 2 American Marines, the last American combat deaths in Vietnam. With the airport unusable, the helicopter evacuation began in earnest. Throughout the day and into the night, Marine CH-53 and CH-46 helicopters flew non-stop shuttles from Saigon to the fleet. Pilots flew exhausted, beyond their normal crew limits. Aircraft exceeded their designed capacity. Helicopters rated for 40 passengers carried 60 or more. At the U.S. Embassy, crowds of Vietnamese pressed against the gates. Some had evacuation credentials. Many didn't. All knew what was coming, if they stayed. Embassy staff tried to maintain order, but the situation was overwhelming. Inside the compound, thousands waited for their turn to climb to the roof where helicopters landed every 10 minutes. The rooftop, that image, the helicopter on the rooftop, became iconic for a reason. It captured everything about the war's end: desperate, chaotic, undignified. Americans had arrived in Vietnam with confidence and unlimited resources. We left from a rooftop, unable to save everyone we'd promised to protect. Ambassador Graham Martin, ill with pneumonia, refused to leave until the bitter end. He was finally ordered out by President Ford. One of the last helicopters carried Martin and the embassy's American flag, the same flag that had flown over the compound throughout the war. The abandoned here's the hardest part of the story. When the last Americans lifted off from the embassy rooftop at 7:53 a.m. on April 30th, hundreds of Vietnamese were still inside the compound. Thousands more were at other planned pickup points around the city, waiting for helicopters that would never come. These people had believed American promises. They had risked everything to help us. Now they watched the helicopters depart, knowing they'd been left behind. Many later spent years in communist re-education camps. Some died there. Others eventually escaped Vietnam as boat people, beginning new lives as refugees. The victory hours. After the last American helicopter departed, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. A North Vietnamese officer ran up the steps and planted his flag. It was over. Vietnam was united under communist rule after 30 years of war. For Americans watching on television, the images of tanks rolling through Saigon's streets carried a message. We had lost. This was what defeat looked like. The most powerful nation on earth had been unable to achieve its objectives after more than a decade of fighting. The human cost. Let's talk numbers, because they matter. 58,000 Americans dead, 300,000 Americans wounded. But that's just part of the story. More than 1 million Vietnamese soldiers died from both sides. Perhaps 2 million Vietnamese civilians were killed. The country was devastated. Unexploded ordnance still kills people today. Agent Orange still affects new generations. In America, the returning veterans faced a hostile reception unlike any in our history. They were spat upon, called baby killers, denied jobs. Many suffered from PTSD that went undiagnosed for decades. Suicide rates among Vietnam veterans are still elevated today. The refugees. In the years following Saigon's fall, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled the country. The boat people risked everything on rickety boats, hoping to reach safety. Many died at sea. Those who survived ended up in refugee camps throughout Southeast Asia. Eventually, many came to America. Today, Vietnamese American communities thrive across the United States. They're a testament to resilience and to America's complex relationship with the war. We fought against Vietnamese communism, then welcomed Vietnamese refugees fleeing that same communism. The lessons. So what did the fall of Saigon teach us? Several things, and we're still learning them. First, military power has limits. You can't bomb your way to a political solution. You can't kill enough of the enemy to make them give up if their will is stronger than yours. Technology and firepower don't guarantee victory. Second, exit strategies matter. We went into Vietnam without a clear definition of victory and without a realistic plan for how to leave. The chaos of the final evacuation was partly because we never planned for the possibility of defeat. Third, credibility is precious. The credibility gap between what officials said and what was actually happening destroyed public trust. That trust is hard to rebuild. Every administration since has had to deal with the shadow of Vietnam. Fourth, we have obligations to those who help us. The images of Vietnamese left behind haunt us because they violated a fundamental principle. If people risk their lives to help America, we should do everything possible to protect them when things go wrong. The memory. The fall of Saigon marked the end of America's first lost war. That's how it was perceived then, and that perception shaped American foreign policy for decades. We became more cautious about military intervention. The phrase "another Vietnam" became shorthand for a military quagmire. But here's something important. The end wasn't the whole story. What happened afterward? The boat people being welcomed to America, Vietnamese refugees rebuilding their lives, former enemies eventually normalizing relations. That's part of the story too. What we've learned. We've traveled through 4 distinct aspects of America's longest war. The helicopters that revolutionized warfare but couldn't deliver victory. The tunnel rats who fought in darkness beneath the jungle. The Tet Offensive that changed American perceptions. And the chaotic fall of Saigon that marked defeat. Each of these stories teaches us something. The helicopters show us that technological superiority isn't enough. The tunnel rats demonstrate that courage and innovation matter, but individual heroism can't overcome strategic mistakes. Tet proves that perception shapes reality in ways that battlefield victories can't overcome. And Saigon's fall reminds us that wars end, sometimes badly, and we have to live with the consequences. The persistent questions. More than 50 years later, Americans still argue about Vietnam. Could we have won with different tactics? Was the war fundamentally unwinnable? Did the media lose the war? Did politicians lose it? Did we abandon South Vietnam prematurely? These debates continue because Vietnam challenged core American beliefs. We'd never lost a war before. We believed in our military superiority, our technological edge, our ability to help others defend themselves against communism. Vietnam shook all of that. The personal cost. Behind all the strategy and tactics and politics were real people. The 19-year-old soldier on his first combat patrol. The helicopter pilot flying his 100th mission. The tunnel rat crawling into darkness. The Marine fighting house to house in Hueys. The Vietnamese translator waiting for an evacuation that never came. These people didn't make policy. They didn't decide to go to war or how to fight it. They followed orders, did their duty, and paid the price. Many paid with their lives. Others paid in different ways. Nightmares, broken marriages, addiction, homelessness, suicide. Vietnam's shadow. Every American military conflict since Vietnam has been measured against it. When we went into Iraq, people asked, "Is this another Vietnam?" Afghanistan became America's longest war, surpassing Vietnam's duration. And the comparisons were inevitable. The irregular warfare, the unclear objectives, the difficulty of knowing if we were winning. The military learned from Vietnam. We reformed training, improved tactics, focused on counterinsurgency. The all-volunteer force replaced the draft. We got better at many things, but some lessons are harder to learn, like how to align military objectives with political realities, or how to maintain public support for long wars. The wall on the National Mall in Washington. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial stands as a black granite wall inscribed with 58,000 names. It's simple, elegant, and profound. People come to touch names, leave flowers, make rubbings. They come to remember. Maya Lin, who designed the memorial, was only 21 when her design was selected. She understood something important. The memorial shouldn't make political statements about whether the war was right or wrong. It should honor those who served and died. That's what it does. The wall is reflective. When you look at the names, you see your own reflection among them. That was intentional. It reminds us that war involves everyone, not just those who fight, but those who send them, those who support them, and those who remember them. Moving forward. So what do we do with these lessons? How do we honor those who served while being honest about the war's failures? First, we remember. We tell these stories, the good, the bad, the complicated. We don't sanitize history or pretend the war was something it wasn't. We acknowledge both the courage of those who fought and the mistakes of those who sent them. Second, we learn. We study Vietnam not to refight old battles, but to avoid repeating mistakes. We ask hard questions about military intervention, about clear objectives, about exit strategies, about the gap between what leaders say and what's actually happening. Third, we support veterans. Not just Vietnam veterans, though we owe them a particular debt, given how they were treated when they came home. But all veterans. They answer when called. They deserve our support when they return. The final lesson. Perhaps the ultimate lesson of Vietnam is humility. Humility about what military power can achieve. Humility about our understanding of other cultures. Humility about the limits of technology. Humility about our ability to shape other nations' futures. This doesn't mean retreating from the world or refusing to use military force when necessary. It means being thoughtful about when and how we use that force. It means being honest with the American people about costs and risks. It means having clear objectives and realistic plans for achieving them. A personal note to listeners. If you're a Vietnam veteran listening to this, thank you. Thank you for your service and your sacrifice. You did your duty in difficult circumstances. Whatever debates continue about the war itself, there's no debate about your courage and commitment. If you're younger and learning about Vietnam for the first time, I hope this helps you understand not just what happened, but why it matters. The helicopter pilots, the tunnel rats, the Marines at Huey, the people on that embassy rooftop, they were real. Their experiences were real. The lessons of their service are still relevant. Closing the Vietnam War was America's longest war, but its impact extends far beyond those years of active combat. It shaped American society, changed how we view military intervention, influenced international relations, and left wounds that took decades to begin healing. We studied helicopters that transformed warfare, tunnel rats who fought in impossible conditions, the Tet Offensive that changed everything despite being a military victory, and the fall of Saigon that marked a painful end. Each of these stories is part of a larger narrative about American power, its possibilities, and its limits. The lessons aren't simple. History never is. But they're worth learning, worth remembering, and worth passing on to new generations. Because those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and the lessons of Vietnam were learned at too high a cost to be forgotten. Thank you for listening.